For centuries, Henry VIII has been remembered as the boisterous monarch with a towering appetite and a trail of doomed queens. We picture him laughing at banquets, brandishing a turkey leg, and declaring new wives with a flick of a royal hand. But what if that portrait, the one burned into our textbooks and television dramas, was nothing but a polished illusion? What if behind the golden crown and the thunderous laughter lived something monstrous? The truth is far darker than most dare to imagine. Beneath the silks and the scepter, Henry VIII was a man consumed by disease, paranoia, and pain so violent it warped his very soul. His body became a battlefield, his mind a storm, and those who loved him most were trapped inside the wreckage. In this story, we peel away the myths and face the nightmare. These are the 5 hidden truths about Henry's private life, secrets so disturbing they were nearly erased from history. From the stench of rotting flesh to the mental decay that drove a king to madness, this is not the Henry your teachers told you about. And by the time we reach number 5, you'll understand why historians still whisper his name with unease. Let's step into the darkness. Number 1, the rotting king's physical horror. Forget the image of the proud, larger-than-life ruler on his throne. By the time Henry reached middle age, his kingdom may have been vast, but his body had become a decaying empire of its own. Behind closed doors, the once handsome warrior who dazzled Europe with his charm had turned into something closer to a corpse than a man. It began in 1536. Years of jousting injuries, infections, and unchecked gluttony caught up to him. His legs erupted into ghastly ulcers, open wounds that never healed. The sores leaked pus day and night, so foul and relentless that courtiers lined the palace halls with bowls of herbs and buckets of burning perfume, desperate to disguise the odor of their dying king. Servants dreaded the task of tending to him. Accounts tell of attendants gagging, fainting, even running from the chamber when the bandages came off. The very air around Henry was heavy with decay, a living fog of sickness. And yet, within that unbearable atmosphere, his wives were ordered to act as if nothing was wrong. Imagine Anne Boleyn, young, clever, and terrified, forced to lie beside a man whose flesh was literally decomposing while he breathed. She could not flinch. She could not recoil. The penalty for revulsion was death. Modern experts believe Henry suffered from osteomyelitis, a devastating bone infection that gnaws through the marrow, causing agony so intense it warps the mind. In Henry's case, the disease didn't just consume his body, it twisted his temper, corroded his reason, and turned his royal will into something monstrous. Those infamous tantrums, the sudden bursts of fury that sent courtiers running, were not merely arrogance or pride. They were the howls of a man being devoured from within. The pain never stopped. It crawled through his bones, seethed under his skin, and drove him into bouts of unpredictable rage that no one dared confront. One whispered letter, attributed to Anne herself, describes nights when she could hear the faint creak and crack of her husband's limbs shifting, the sound of his body breaking itself apart. She wrote of nights spent motionless, terrified, praying for morning while the man beside her groaned in agony and madness. This was Henry not as a monarch, but as a monster made of flesh and pain, a king whose crown hid a skull already half in the grave. His wives weren't queens in gilded palaces. They were prisoners in a decaying tomb, forced to smile as the air around them filled with the scent of death. But what happened next was even more chilling. Because once the body began to fail, Henry's mind followed, and the man who was already rotting on the outside began to poison everything around him from within. Number 2, the theater of humiliation and control. Few moments in royal history drip with such venom as the fall of Anne Boleyn. What Henry VIII unleashed upon her was not merely punishment, it was artful destruction. He turned marriage into a weapon, love into theater, and death into a performance staged before the eyes of an entire kingdom. To the world, Henry appeared as a divinely appointed ruler, defending his throne from treason. But beneath the gold and the grandeur was a man obsessed with control, a man who derived satisfaction not just from power, but from domination of the mind and soul. And Boleyn was once his muse, his obsession, his rebellion against the Pope himself. Yet when her charm began to fade and her defiance burned too brightly, she became the perfect canvas for his cruelty. When Henry ordered her arrest in 1536, the process was orchestrated like a tragedy. Every step was deliberate, every accusation crafted with surgical precision to strip her of dignity. The charges, adultery, witchcraft, even incest, were absurd, yet Henry ensured the entire realm would believe them. He didn't just want her executed, he wanted her erased. Her name, her bloodline, her very memory, all of it reduced to ash. Imagine and in that courtroom, trembling as she's forced to watch her brother, George Boleyn, accused of unspeakable crimes, sleeping with his own sister. The evidence? Lies whispered by courtiers eager to please the king. And there she sits, powerless, watching the axe rise and fall, hearing the crowds roar, smelling the iron scent of her brother's blood. She knows she's next. She knows that this entire performance has been written by the same man who once swore he would love her until his dying breath. And the cruelty didn't stop there. Henry ensured that Anne's 11-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, was made aware of every word. The future queen grew up under the shadow of her mother's public shaming. Even as a child, Elizabeth heard the whispers her mother called a witch, a harlot, a devil's bride. Henry wanted the humiliation to echo across generations, to scar not only Anne but her lineage. The king's vengeance reached even into the nursery. Witnesses later wrote that Henry attended the proceedings with unsettling amusement. He laughed when others wept. Courtiers said his eyes shone not with sorrow or anger, but with pleasure, as if watching a cruel play he himself had written. His mind, poisoned by pain and paranoia, seemed to feed on the suffering he caused. This was not justice. This was sadism wearing a crown. But Anne was not his final victim. When 19-year-old Catherine Howard entered Henry's life, the pattern repeated, only this time darker. Catherine was barely more than a girl, a frightened court beauty suddenly elevated to queen beside a decaying tyrant old enough to be her grandfather. Henry saw her youth as a tonic, a cure for his failing body. But to Catherine, the marriage was a sentence. Servants whispered that she cried every night before being summoned to his chambers. Her sobs echoed through the corridors of Hampton Court like a ghostly hymn of fear. Those who tended to her later recalled that she often trembled so violently that she could not speak when the king approached. She lived not as a queen, but as prey, a young woman trapped in the labyrinth of a monster's mind. Henry's obsession with control extended even to his private moments. He demanded submission not just in politics, but in intimacy. Every glance, every gesture, every breath had to affirm his power. Catherine's tears only deepened his thrill, because Henry's cruelty was no longer merely political. It was personal, ritualistic, and fueled by the delusion that his wives were the source of all his misfortune. And yet, behind those heavy velvet curtains, something even darker unfolded, a world of grotesque rituals and deranged superstition that blurred the line between faith, madness, and decay. Number 3. The rituals of madness. If Henry's public cruelty revealed his thirst for domination, his private rituals revealed his descent into madness. The royal bedchamber, once the seat of power and intimacy, had become a chamber of horror, where medicine, religion, and insanity merged into nightly ceremony. By this point, Henry's body was a ruin. His infected legs leaked constantly, the stench so unbearable that attendants lined the corridors with lavender and vinegar-soaked cloths. Every night, before he could even attempt sleep, let alone intimacy, his servants performed a grim routine. They drained pus from his wounds, packed them with herbs, wrapped his legs in layers of linen and leather straps to keep the ulcers from tearing open. Imagine the scene. Flickering candlelight, physicians whispering prayers, the king grunting in agony, while the air itself seemed to choke with decay. And through it all, Henry demanded obedience, demanded that his queens lie beside him as though nothing were wrong. But the deeper horror came from his mind. Henry's paranoia had grown so severe that he believed his wives were plotting to kill him, not with daggers or poison and wine, but through touch itself. He began enforcing rituals that bordered on the absurd. Before coming to his bed, queens were forced to perform purity tests. Catherine of Aragon, according to several accounts, was made to lick salt from her own hands while Henry watched, convinced that if she reacted poorly, it meant her skin carried poison. The King of England, ruler of millions, had become a man terrified of his own shadow, a prisoner of delusion. And as the years dragged on, the line between superstition and insanity vanished. Henry became convinced that his physical failures were not of the flesh, but of the soul. He began to see his impotence and illness as divine punishment, God's wrath for his broken vows and murdered queens. So he tried to appease heaven through ritual. He spent vast sums on crucifixes, blessed oils, and holy relics. Servants sprinkled holy water on his bed before every encounter. Priests were summoned to bless the royal sheets. Some nights, Henry would pray before the crucifix for hours, muttering that God had cursed his bloodline. Other nights, he wept, demanding that physicians bring him relics of saints to heal his manhood. It was a grotesque mingling of religion and desperation, a king trying to bribe the divine to restore what disease had taken from him. The truth is, all these bizarre rituals were nothing more than camouflage, a frantic attempt to hide his humiliation. Beneath the ointments, the relics, the incense, and the prayer, Henry's body was collapsing. His once proud vigor was gone. His strength, his virility, his self-image, all of it rotted away, just like the flesh of his legs. In his mind, his failing body was proof that heaven itself had turned against him. And so, he turned against the world, against his wives, his friends, even his own children. The king who once ruled through charm and charisma had become something far more terrifying, a decaying god, enthroned in madness, waging war not against nations, but against his own humanity. And as his body continued to betray him, the violence of his soul only grew more unrestrained, setting the stage for the bloodiest years of his reign. Number 4. The mighty king's ultimate humiliation. By the 1540s, the empire Henry VIII had built through blood and iron began to decay, just like the man himself. The thunder of his youth, the confident voice that had once shaken kingdoms, now came from a bloated body and a mind trembling under its own weight. The monarch who had ruled through sheer force of will, who had dared to split his kingdom from the Church of Rome and declare himself the head of God's order on earth, could no longer command his own flesh. The great Lion of England had been reduced to a pitiful creature, roaring only to remind the world that he still existed. Those closest to the king knew the truth, though few dared to speak it aloud. Henry was no longer capable of performing the duties of a husband or a father. His infected legs oozed constantly, his breath carried the stench of decay, and the once powerful body that had jousted, hunted, and seduced was now imprisoned in layers of fat, bandages, and shame. The man who had condemned wives for failing to give him sons could no longer even attempt to create them. It was the cruelest irony in royal history. The man who shattered Europe over the right to remarry had become physically incapable of consummating any union. Each night was a descent into humiliation. In the privacy of his chambers, Henry faced the one enemy he could not behead, his own weakness. Servants heard the crashes of overturned furniture, the guttural screams, the curses flung toward heaven. The king who once terrified nations now terrified his own attendants. Courtiers tiptoed through Whitehall, speaking in whispers, afraid that a single wrong glance might bring a death sentence. But the tragedy went deeper than physical ruin. Henry's mind, poisoned by years of pain and paranoia, began rewriting reality to protect his pride. He blamed his wives for his failures, not out of reason, but necessity. His masculinity had been the cornerstone of his identity, and now that it was crumbling, he had to build a new delusion to hold his throne together. When young Catherine Howard failed to conceive, it was she, not Henry, who was accused of sin. Her supposed adultery, historians now believe, was nothing more than a desperate fabrication designed to shield the king's image from ridicule. But to Henry, it became gospel. He convinced himself that her betrayal had infected his body, that her impurity had offended God. When she was executed, it wasn't justice, it was an exorcism. The palace record from these years read like the diary of a madman. Henry would erupt in rage after failed attempts at intimacy, throwing chairs, smashing mirrors, and demanding executions for imagined slights. One chronicler described the royal bedchamber as a place of screams and weeping. To the court, it was clear King of England had turned his pain into policy. The death of others became his medicine. And then came his most disturbing delusion yet. Henry began to believe that God was punishing him through impotence, and that if he killed enough sinners, heaven might restore his strength. It sounds unthinkable, but it's recorded fact. After 1540, his executions multiplied dramatically. He saw them not as cruelty, but as offerings. Every drop of blood spilled was a desperate prayer to the God who no longer answered him. The Tower of London became his confessional. The axe, his only form of redemption. This is where the grandeur of the Tudor myth collapses. The mighty king who ruled with divine confidence had become a beggar before his own deity, trading human lives for the illusion of virility. His throne had turned into a pulpit of madness, his crown into a symbol of decay. Only one woman escaped his madness with her life and dignity intact, Anne of Cleves. She saw through the mask immediately. The man who summoned her was not a king, but a ruin wearing robes. Within days of their marriage, she requested an annulment, claiming that they were as brother and sister. It was the most intelligent act of self-preservation in Tudor history. By stepping away from Henry's humiliation, she became the only queen who survived him, proof that wisdom, not submission, was the only escape from his darkness. But as his flesh failed and his sanity slipped further, Henry's self-loathing metastasized into something greater, a sickness that would outlive him and echo across centuries. His decay was no longer his own. It had infected history itself. Number 5, the legacy of a monster's bedroom failures. Now comes the part of the story that few people truly grasp, the part that turns personal weakness into world-altering tragedy. Henry's collapse wasn't just a royal scandal. It was the spark that ignited centuries of conflict. His private shame reshaped civilization. We're told in school that Henry's split from Rome was a political masterstroke, a bold act of sovereignty that birthed the Church of England. But behind the rhetoric of divine authority and national pride was something far more human and far more pathetic. Henry's decision to sever England from Catholicism was driven not by faith or ideology, but by insecurity. His inability to father a male heir and his desperate need to blame others for it pushed him toward decisions that bled across centuries. Because Henry could not face his own impotence, the entire Western world was forced to live with its consequences. His need to replace wives, to punish and destroy them when they failed to produce sons, created a domino effect that reshaped Europe's spiritual map. The Protestant Reformation in England, the executions of priests, the burning of martyrs, the wars of religion that followed, all of it began with one man's refusal to admit he was broken. Think about it. Millions of lives were lost, not because of political theory or theological debate, but because one diseased king refused to face his reflection. Henry's ego became doctrine, his pride, a religion. The Church of England was not born from enlightenment. It was born from shame. But Henry's legacy extends beyond religion. His psychology, that volatile blend of pride, fear, and projection, became a model for tyranny itself. Dictators throughout history have borrowed from his playbook. When you fail, destroy the evidence. When you're weak, pretend to be strong. When the truth threatens your image, erase those who speak it. From a secret police of Stalin to the propaganda machines of Hitler and Mao, the same pattern repeats, the same disease spreading from century to century. The tyrant cannot admit fault, so he turns the world into his mirror, forcing it to reflect perfection while he rots inside. Henry VIII was not the first man to do this, but he was the one who showed how powerful and devastating the lie could be. And even now, In our modern world, the echo of Henry's sickness persists. You can see in boardrooms, in politics, in the lives of powerful men who destroy others to protect their egos. Every time a leader refuses accountability, every time someone blames the innocent to hide their weakness, the ghost of Henry VIII stirs. He lives not in the palaces of England, but in every corner of power corrupted by fear and pride. Henry wanted immortality, and in a way, he achieved it. But not through greatness, not through glory. His immortality is disease. His legacy is infection. He proved that the most dangerous force in history is not ambition or greed. It is insecurity armed with power. His rotting body became a mirror of his rotting soul, and the stench of his reign never truly faded. 5 centuries later, we still live with the consequences of his fear. The world he broke apart has never fully healed. His life reminds us that when power loses humility and when pride silences truth, even a king can become the architect of his own damnation. That is the real story of Henry VIII, not the feasts, not the wives, not the portraits. It is the story of a man eaten alive by his own ego, who mistook cruelty for strength and left the scars of his weakness etched across the face of history.